So, a little bit of context before I start the video. In my last video, I basically had to downplay Jotaro heavily for a JJK fight, and I stated in that video, I don't necessarily agree with the idea that Jotaro got weaker over time. I actually heavily dislike this idea a lot, because what comes with this idea is that Jotaro is just some weakling after part 3, like he doesn't matter, he's a low tier, he's just garbage. Like this whole nerfed idea is just really bad in my eyes. I think it mainly comes from the fact when people say nerfed or weakened, they think that person is now at the bottom of the list, when in reality, sometimes that never happens. Looking at some video games for examples, sometimes top tier characters get nerfed, but are never removed from their top tier spot. And the sweet reality of it, Jotaro was always a top tier from the start. Jotaro has never fallen from grace, and the only time he ever did was, well, when he was fighting something that was clearly out of his league. So let's debunk this. With that being said, hello, my name is Metas. And I feel like where we should start off first is with part 3 Jotaro to see where he was at during this part and moving on forward with it. And I will say this, I'm not going to go too crazy power scaling on you guys. I don't think this is justified in this kind of argument. I'm going to kind of like present a really casual and large brushstroke kind of analysis on Jotaro and his strength within the series, kind of from Araki's perspective, because from that perspective from the old man himself, it reveals a lot about Jotaro's strengths. From the offset, Jotaro is perceived by the audience, and especially me, as being ridiculously overpowered. Just like his predecessors Jonathan and Joseph, he is a Goliath of a man, effortlessly beating other men down pretty casually in my opinion. However, that is then elevated once Jotaro is revealed to be a stand user with Star Platinum. Here's where shit starts to get extremely wild. Not only is the stand shown to be extremely precision based with a high amount of speed thrown in there, but also is just in terms of physical strength an absolute monster. His fights with Magician's Red and Hierophant Green show this perfectly. Jotaro is just physically way stronger than any of the opponents he will ever face up until the end of the series, with a few outliers. That's mainly backed up by the fact that when anybody tries to fight him, they're usually overconfident, but then immediately regret it as they see Jotaro as an absolute unit, which he definitely is. Most of part 3 stand fights are literally just this: the villain coming in thinking they're the absolute strongest, no one's going to be able to defeat him, the Stardust Crusaders are cooked. And then immediately it's turned around as they realize Jotaro is just too freakishly overpowered for any of them to beat. And this makes sense. He's able to destroy a small portion of a building, being able to destroy large boulders effortlessly, has been shown to keep up, if not surpass stands with speeds close to relativistic, or at bare minimum, be as fast as light. I know those are power scaling terms, but it's pretty clear through Araki himself that this stand, Star Platinum and Jotaro, are just supposed to be that fast. It's just a fact I think a lot of people are just going to have to deal with, even at a casual level, and is extremely durable on top of all of that, shown within the Dio fight. And speaking about Dio, let's talk about Enya real quick. And you're probably wondering, what do you mean? Enya? Why is she relevant to this conversation at all? Here's the thing that I need to preface, and this is pretty hyper obscure. I will bring up the data book guides every so often within this video to kind of prove a point, but I'm not going to nerd out about them, except for this one time. In the Jojonium, in part 3 for Enya, at the very end about the interview about her character, Araki decides to drop this line. You're reading that correctly. She is directly compared to the strongest stand user at the time, verbatim from the author's mouth. Not Vanilla Ice, not Endul, but Enya. Enya is basically stated to be the second strongest person within Dio's Legion. Jotaro beat her halfway through part 3. No wonder all the other characters he ever fought after her were all gimmick based. He was just that physically powerful with his stand. His stand power was insane. Jotaro halfway through his own part was an end tier level character. However, it gets even better for him. He then fights Dio, who is basically just a carbon copy in terms of stats with the world 2-star platinum. Dio, over his fight with Jotaro, gets stronger by sucking the blood out of Joseph, making him a full vampire. Do you know what Jotaro does after that? He takes a page out of Gohan's book and gets a rage boost, and then straight up surpasses the vampire with one of the strongest stands in the world. Why this is insane, by the way, is in part 2, it's basically stated vampires are just stronger than humans. Jotaro, technically speaking, is just a regular human with a stand. However, his rage boost alone, in combination with his stand, basically surpasses a vampire with a stand who should be just stronger than a regular vampire to begin with. So if you start doing the math, Jotaro, by the end of all of this, is just a literal freak of nature. There's no other way to explain it. And you know, on top of all of that, he gains 5 seconds of frozen time, which is just insane. You know what you can do in 5 seconds of frozen time? Endlessly beat your opponent or reposition yourself so you can eventually beat your opponent once time stop ends. There's a lot of things you can do with time stop. That's just the basic stuff I would say Jotaro would use with it, but I think you get the premise. Jotaro is just overall insane in terms of physical stats and hacks. However, I would like to say this, even when he can't physically beat his opponents down, he is still intelligent enough to outsmart them. A lot of the time in part 3, stands have a gimmick to them to where it kind of makes Jotaro and crew have to not use their physical abilities too hard until the very end. Jotaro is one of those characters who actually thinks intelligently enough to where he can outsmart most stand users without having to use his full physical force. So you're basically dealing with a highly intelligent weapon of mass destruction. Part 3 Jotaro, if you haven't gotten it by now, is an absolute phenom. But that's where I think this problem starts to arise, is because of part 3 and moving on forwards to parts 4 and 6. Due to part 3 Jotaro's phenom status and the lack of showings in part 4 and the kind of like underselling of his power, I think a lot of people think he gets weak in this part. Actually, I think a majority of people who watch JoJo's think that Jotaro gets weak in this part. However, that is not the fact at all. If anything, he is still the same level he was at part 3, if not a tad bit stronger. Looking at the evidence here, the only thing that is not in favor for Jotaro is the fact that he himself states that his time stop has gotten weaker over these past 10 years, from 5 seconds to a miserable half a second time stop. But that's about it when it comes to negative things for Jotaro in this part. Everything else afterwards is pretty good for the guy, shockingly enough. I think personally one of the most impressive feats in this part is the fact that Jotaro survives sheer heart attack. Never before in the series has Jotaro taken this much damage. Just visually looking at it, comparing what happened during part 3 with the fight with Dio, sheer heart attack does more damage to Jotaro, and Jotaro is still able to, sometime afterwards, be able to get up and still pummel Kira, which leads us into our second statement. Kira says to himself that Jotaro is so fast it's almost like time is slowing down. With a statement like this, it basically confirms the fact that Jotaro has always been in that relativistic slash faster than light category in terms of speed. So all those data book guides basically get confirmed by Kira here in this statement. Now I'm already going to guess some of you are going to be like, what about sheer heart attack metas? Jotaro wasn't able to destroy it completely, so he must have gotten weaker in that regard, right? No, and this is where things get really weird in terms of power scaling, even when it comes to casually doing it from Araki's perspective. Sheer heart attack, and Kira in general with Killer Queen, is just that overpowered? So I'm already guessing your mouth is on the floor once I said that. This is backed up in Manga Theory in Practice in an interview stated by Araki and the JoJo Veller. Kira and Killer Queen are just that physically powerful for whatever reason, making this the first time that Jotaro has ever been power crept. Keep that in mind, we will be using it for later. So in general, using Occam's razor and the evidence we've already previously established with part 4 Jotaro, he is as strong as his part 3 counterpart, if not just a little bit stronger. However, I'm already going to guess that some people are going to be like, no Jotaro, I am Jotaro. No, Metas, you can't say that because we have the time stop problem. This Occam's razor solution to this whole Jotaro thing here in part 4 can't be the answer. Well, here's the thing. If we look at the lore of Jotaro, what he was doing in those 10 years, it actually supports this side of my argument pretty well. We know that sometime after part 3, Polnareff and Jotaro would go on adventures looking for the stand arrows. And we know damn well, anytime somebody tries to find those things, shenanigans are afoot. This is basically confirmed in 4, 5, and 6. Also, technically speaking, all of Polnareff's backstory in part 5 is because he was looking for stand arrows. Therefore meaning that Jotaro was probably fighting stand users during this 10-year time skip, especially within that first year. This is backed up by the fact that Jotaro, within his fight against sheer heart attack, telling Koichi that sheer heart attack is an automatic stand. Jotaro has only ever fought one automatic stand that we know of before this, that being Osiris. However, nobody in the Stardust Crusaders actually pointed out the fact that it was an automatic type stand, meaning that during these 10 years, Jotaro must have fought other stand users to eventually gain that knowledge. Jotaro also makes it pretty clear that sheer heart attack compared to other automatic stands is in a completely different league of its own, meaning that he has to compare it to something else that he's not telling us. Therefore, meaning and backing up all my stuff I've said basically in this video, during that 10-year time skip, Jotaro was clearly doing some stand fighting, keeping up to date with his strength. The only thing that he wasn't keeping up to date with was his time stop. Why, you might say? Well, we'll probably never find out the true reason, but I can probably make an educated guess that Jotaro just deemed all of his physical strengths just better and he just didn't need to use it for whatever reason, is my guess. Now, I do also want to go over Jotaro's intelligence and wisdom within this part just a little bit, as I do find it pretty fascinating overall. The biggest example of this is of course the sheer heart attack fight, where Jotaro is slowly dissecting and analyzing the enemy stand in front of him as he's telling Koichi in real time, using his previous experience against other automatic stand users to guide him in this fight. Another one would be the fight against the rat, and I know automatically some people are going to be pressed about this, but listen here, bitch. The reason why he got hurt during that entire fight was because he knew he could take the chance because he had the best fucking healer in the entire franchise right next to him. He did all that stupid shit to ensure Josuke could protect Morio. It was all one giant test to see if the kid could do it. Jotaro has been shown in part 3 to easily snipe somebody if he wanted to. I don't know how many times I have to explain that to somebody. And for anybody wondering about the time stop stuff being weak or whatever, he can't consecutively do it. If he does, it gets weaker. This is stated in part 6. Dio is the only one capable of spamming it without it being degraded, with multiple consecutive uses. So overall, Part 4 Jotaro is still a monster. Even though he got slightly tweaked, he isn't nerfed into oblivion like a lot of people think for some reason. He is still a monster. Even then, in series, it is still backed up that he is still one of the strongest stand users on the entire planet, even though he has a 2-second time stop. He is still a monster. Let's move on to Part 6, Stone Ocean, and this version of Jotaro. And it kind of gets murky here, or at least I would say in terms of stats, because there basically is none other than stand stat statements. The two stand stat statements we have for Star Platinum basically read almost the same, except one is a bit more descriptive, and both of them kind of read like their Part 4 variant back in the day, basically saying that he has a very long time stop during his prime and currently right now, on top of having an incredible base level of speed, power, and precision unrivaled within this verse. We can come to two different conclusions with the information that we have currently. One, a lack of evidence. This is basically the only thing we have within this part, so there's really nothing concrete to go off of, so we just have to say, out of a lack of evidence, we can't exactly determine Jotaro's power level within this part. Second, we take it at face value and say he's basically the same as he was in Part 4, however, he has a longer time stop now, as assuming here, after Part 4, he got a clue and said, I should probably raise my time limit increase back to 5 seconds. And for anybody wondering about, Manhattan Transfer and his 2-second time stop there, that was all entirely a dream sequence, by the way, so it probably doesn't count. Anyway, moving on. The only thing I can speak on in terms of stats here going onward is probably his intelligence. Yet again, he is still slowly analyzing and then slowly dissecting his opponent before he beats them down, looking at Manhattan Transfer and Made in Heaven to the best of his ability, at least in that case. So we finally come to this part of the video. Why did Part 6 Jotaro, if he is comparable to Part 4 Jotaro, and that Jotaro is somewhat comparable to Part 3 Jotaro, lose to Made in Heaven Pucci? Isn't Jotaro supposed to be the strongest, the fastest, the ultimate stand, stated in Part 4 and Part 6? How did he lose metas? Well, it wasn't because he was nerfed. All evidence is pointing that Jotaro has basically stayed the same, if not gotten a little bit stronger over time. He basically got beat, well, because he was just weaker and he was out-prepped basically by Made in Heaven Pucci. That's just the answer of it. Jotaro Kujo and Star Platinum the World basically got power creeped out of existence, to oblivion, to death. It is made pretty clear by Araki himself, stated in series and out of series in the Stone Ocean Bunko, that Made in Heaven was so ridiculously overpowered, such a incredibly insane stand, that Araki felt like he had peaked in terms of power system. And honestly, it makes sense. When you're fighting characters with a finite amount of speed versus a guy with an infinite amount of speed, you really honestly get your answer in full here. Jotaro got speed blitzed twice in this fight. Not once, twice. It wasn't because he didn't use Starfinger or because he was nerfed or because he was old and weak. No, he lost because he got power creeped. Made in Heaven was built to be one of the strongest stands. Araki was clearly setting a precedent of how powerful Made in Heaven was. He effortlessly cleaves through Jotaro twice. His 8P, whatever it may be, if you want to casually do it or highball it, being a power scaler, has to be far higher than Jotaro's durability, which has to be extremely high. On top of that, from what we can tell, time stop was shortened, quote unquote. It's very unclear what the hell that meant. So if anything, Made in Heaven has an advantage in terms of time manipulating ability over Jotaro, and the fact that Pucci just outsmarted Jotaro. He knew he would want to protect his daughter, so he used that against him. In all reality, any other argument is basically trying to huff copium. Pucci was just the better stand user and had the better stand. It is sadly just the reality of the situation. Now, spinning back to the beginning of the video, in terms of power scaling, what can you do here? Basically, it's not too complicated. Just start upping the stats and it still makes sense. It's not too crazy, shockingly enough, if you want to be one of those fans like myself. The only problem I have with any of this is sheer heart attack. I can't wrap my head around the fact that Araki thinks that motherfucker is that seriously overpowered. It bugs me, but I just have to accept that reality. Sheer heart attack is just crazy overpowered. Now, with that all being said, if you have any questions, please ask them in the comment section and I will answer them gladly. I have a ton of information basically supporting me. I have a whole ass document that I've been reading off of for this video in its entirety. So yeah, if you have any questions, please ask me and I will give you the answer. Well, with that all being said, like, comment, share, subscribe, follow me on Twitter, stay hydrated, and I will see you in the next one, ladies and gentlemen. Deuces.